Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for that warm welcome. Indeed, what we're here to talk about today is low code being not just for non-technical folks, but also for developers. So hello, my name is Bear, and I lead the developer relations team over at Slack. My pronouns are she and her, and I've been at Slack for 4 years this week. I think I hit my 4 years on Saturday, so it's been a while. So at Slack, developer relations is a team that's in general responsible for writing our documentation, writing our frameworks and SDKs, and also running programs to help developers build great apps on our platform. And because Slack is a business tool, most of the integrations that get written with Slack are with other business software. And because so many of our developers who use the platform are engineers inside large corporations, they tend to be writing apps for Slack that help bring tools their team are already using into Slack in ways that save them time and effort. So things like bringing pull requests in from GitHub, or approval notifications for PTO requests in Workday, or things like analytics updates from internal systems. And because so many of our developers are writing that type of integration, bringing some element of third-party systems into Slack for action to be taken, we've had a front row seat to seeing this explosion in the popularity of low-code platforms over the last few years. And I really do mean explosion. Gartner estimates that by 2024, low-code application development will be responsible for more than 65% of application development activity. That's wild. And by 2024, 75% of large enterprises will be using at least 4 low-code development tools for IT application development and citizen development initiatives. So I considered making a slide with all the logos of the various low-code platforms that have come out in the last few years. And after I hit 24, I was like, this is a waste of my time and probably not that interesting for everybody to see this NASCAR slide. But you can see here that not only are we seeing a lot of apps being built, but such a proliferation in tools means that enterprises are going to be using more than one. And so you might be asking yourself, though, reading this slide, what is citizen development, Gartner? And so Gartner's definition is here. A citizen developer is a user who creates new business applications for consumption by others, and this is the critical part, using development and runtime environments sanctioned by corporate IT. So the key there is that corporate IT can pre-sanction the tools and runtime environments that you can use, and then once you're over that barrier with compliance, you're relatively free to create whatever your team needs. And that's one of the key benefits of low-code platforms that has been driving their popularity over the last several years. Low-code platforms offer huge benefits to corporate IT teams. Let's go to that one first, creating the profile of a citizen developer. So at Slack, one of the early gripes that admins at large corporations had about our API was that we had an access token scope that we generally called bot that was way too permissive. It enabled the bearer to access channel history and other sensitive data kind of indiscriminately. And so corporate admins hated it, so much so that many of them simply would not grant their developers access to develop on Slack until we broke that scope down into smaller component parts, which we did. We now have a more granular permission system that we call, very prosaically, granular permissions with the bot token. But all of that is to say that the controls that low-code platforms afford IT teams when it comes to things like data audits or enforcing compliance with regulations like HIPAA are a major reason that companies love these platforms. So the second thing is that part of having citizen developers is that you may not need to be a full-time engineer anymore to build these types of integration and workflow that make your life and your team's life easier. At Slack, we call this phrase citizen developer, we call them builders. They're people who enjoy practical problem solving, can write an Excel macro maybe, and have the drive to simplify and automate more of their workday. And it's that drive that really determines a builder. It's that you see a problem and you go ahead and overcome whatever barriers you might need. Maybe it's learning a new tool. Maybe it's finding out who can give you permission to write these integrations in order to actually solve those problems for their team. And they're hard to find because there's no one job title or skill profile on LinkedIn that they hold, but they've got the skills and, more importantly, the gumption to write this type of tool. The other thing that low-code platforms and their users like to cite about why they enjoy using them is the speed of development, or sometimes that's called time to value, that you see from using their tools. So you see that reflected in the customer testimonials that a lot of these low-code platforms are putting forward in their marketing materials. So OutSystems, for example, cites Schneider Electric launched 60 apps in 20 months, with most delivered in 10 weeks. Ryko replaced legacy systems, achieving 253% ROI and a payback for the cost of the tool in just 7 months. So these are the type of things that the low-code platforms are using to promote themselves. It's the speed of development. And there are also returns on maintainability. As more citizen developers, builders, level up inside your company and get familiar with these tools, that's a broader pool of people who can work on operating and owning these integrations that anyone can write. So the last thing is about responsiveness on feedback and product updates, which is pretty critical to how we think about building these tools inside Slack. I'll be talking about our Slack on Slack program a little bit later in this talk. It's the difference between using a CMS to manage content versus hand-rolling everything anytime you want to make a copy change, for example. Low-code tools make it so much simpler to update basic things like if your app copy is confusing, or if there's something about the onboarding flow that needs improvement or clarification. The people who are writing these types of tool have a faster feedback loop with the people who they're serving. And these are all of the places that low-code really shines and have been a reason that we use low-code platforms inside Slack for our own business and IT tools. But some developers sneer at low-code platforms. And I want to be honest right out the gate that for some people, that is pure elitism and gatekeeping nonsense. Some people don't like low-code platforms because they don't like that it means more people can write code, and they assume that the end product has to be crappy because of who wrote it. So I'm just going to let that sit for a minute before moving on. And it's true that many people still do like low-code platforms, but when I hear groans or objections for developers who don't want to use these tools, it's usually one of these things. First, there's an assumption that the platform is not as flexible as you might need, and that eventually you'll run into roadblocks based on the features that they offer, or that you might want to use in the future. And the second point is similar, that you might want to move off the surface one day and find it hard, or you might find that something somebody wrote 3 years ago is hopelessly out of date and needs constant rewriting. These are reasonable concerns, though what I think needs to be said is that they are possible future problems rather than problems of today. So when you're thinking about how you should weigh them, you should consider them as possible future states rather than something that needs to be solved here and now. When you think about what's the cost of rewriting with a low-code tool, maybe if you're moving it to another platform, compared to the cost of rewriting the one you wrote from scratch. I think anybody who has maintained code over any long period of time knows that rewrites happen, and it's not necessarily more costly to rewrite on a low-code platform than it is to rewrite something that you wrote. The next objection I hear quite a bit is that they're harder to debug because the services act like a black box. And that is perfectly fair. And it's also something that's not consistent platform to platform. So if this is something that concerns you, do your research into the platforms that you're considering, since many of them offer different levels of debugging and logging options. And since this is a common piece of developer feedback that they get, many of them are investing in making that tooling better. So you can make sure that you're making an informed choice when you pick your low-code platform, if you decide to use one. The last objection that I hear a lot is that it's expensive. And that's true. A lot of these tools are pricey, and they're pricey for a reason. They sell based on the engineering hours that they're claiming to be able to save you. So cost is a legitimate concern, and it's definitely one to weigh in when you're thinking about whether or not a low-code tool should be something that's part of your toolbox. But what I'm here to argue today is that low-code has its time and place for almost every team. And team can be loosely defined here. We can be talking about your local team. For me, that would be developer relations, or it could be your team, meaning the entire company. But I apply this to my own local team as well, developer relations. As a team, we build a lot of samples that we open source for other people to take and riff on, but we also build frameworks and SDKs and tools for developers, like our SDKs Bolt and the Slack app, Slack developer tools, that is sort of a coding assistant where you can look up information from our docs and also test out some Slack UI, some app UI inside Slack. We build fun sample apps that people can download to their workspace, like Lunch Train, which is a way to take your team to lunch and coordinate when you will all go out together in a time when we can all gather again together and go eat lunch as a group. And we also spend time writing internal utilities for ourselves, like this tool that our developer docs team built. It's just an internal tool to track tasks related to our docs and give people a view into what they're working on. And it's a handy integration that affects our core team of docs writers, which is fewer than 10 people. But we were inspired at one point by a open source app called What Is. It's also in Slack's app directory, if this sounds useful. What is an app where you can define company jargon. So what is Project Nebula? Or what does V2MOM stand for? So that when you're coming into a company and people are throwing around acronyms and terms you've never heard, you can look it up in a common directory. App's called What Is again. And we riffed on it with some internal teams and wanted to launch it internally at Slack under the name Define. And when we brought this to our IT team, we got hit with a lot of questions, which are all perfectly legitimate, but this is only a subset of them. And we got this very intimidating checklist back that said, okay, there's a lot that you need to be responsible for when you launch an internal tool like this. For example, who's taking responsibility for bugs and how will users reach out to them? Where will we go for documentation and to post questions? Who's responsible for maintenance? What if there's downtime? Is there an SLA on downtime? And I don't know about you, but anytime I hear like, you're getting yourself in for an SLA agreement, even internally, it's like, oh God, what are we doing? Was this user tested and piloted? How will we make changes? Are there known limitations? All of these are perfectly fair for any business system that may be business critical, and you should be able to answer these. But if this is just something that you're spinning up to help your team do a thing, that's a lot to be responsible for without some sort of larger structure giving you backing about how you can maintain this. So almost all of these questions would either have been entirely obviated or just made a lot simpler if we had built on top of a low-code platform. And it's not to say you shouldn't use What Is. You should absolutely use What Is. This is just an illustrative example of all the things that we had to be prepared to answer whenever we wanted to launch something at Slack. And so internally at Slack, our BizTech team uses a tool called Workato. It's another low-code tool. And a quick definition for those, I jumped right into this talk assuming you all knew what low-code tooling was. But basically, it's a meta tool for application building that allows you to build apps either completely without code. You can kind of chain logic with either a GUI or some amount of connecting code logic. Some of them enable you to run functions, and their feature sets are really quite different tool to tool. But the idea is that you shouldn't have to know how to spin up a web service end to end in order to get some basic workflow type work done. So inside Slack, we use the tool called Workato. And we have a program called Slack on Slack, which is about enabling people inside the company to suggest workflows that will help them and their teams out. And then our BizTech team responds and tackles them. So our head of IT, Stephen Franchetti, has written some blog posts about how we operate the program. We have a channel inside our common global workspace at Slack where we have a workflow using Slack's workflow builder that allows people to suggest apps that they would like to see out of the BizTech team. And then they work on implementing it, and all communication about future iterations there or follow-ups about what people need from the program happen inside that channel. So this is a screenshot of our Midas TouchBot, which I think is super cool when I found out about it. It builds a custom sales deck for sales managers on accounts based on that account's usage data and so on with just a few clicks. And this saves our sales team hours, and it's also just a really cool usage of the Google Slides API. So part of the goal of the Slack on Slack program is to be responsive to these employee needs. Somebody on the sales team had this brilliant idea, like, wouldn't it be nice? And the BizTech team responded. And now all of a sudden, creating these pitch decks, these account update decks is a matter of seconds instead of hours of each sales employee's day, which is amazing. And as part of the interest in being responsive as part of Slack on Slack, using a program like Workato is incredibly helpful because iterations based on the feedback are faster, and the people who get to use the tools end up more satisfied because you're being responsive to their feedback. So that's a little bit about how we use low-code platforms internally at Slack. But Slack is also a platform provider. And as such, we have to think about the low-code experiences that we offer directly as part of Slack, and also how we make it possible for low-code vendors and independent developers to provide hooks into our platform. So to give you a sense of the scale, Slack has over 2,400 apps in our app directory. Those are apps that are built by software vendors that they want every Slack user to be able to install in their workspace and use. We see over 700,000 weekly active integrations being used on Slack. And so if you look at the 2,400 number and the 700,000, the rest of that bulk is being made up by people who are writing these types of internal tool. So when we think about our ecosystem of developers, we can't just serve people who know how to build an app end to end and are ready to use our API. We do have to think about the folks, again, who we call builders, who need a little bit more from us in order to be enabled. So in 2018, we acquired a company called Missions, and they made a product inside Slack that allowed you to automate tasks that involve some amount of custom logic without writing code. You can see a screenshot here of how you can create it entirely using a GUI. And we incorporated that product today into Slack into a tool we call Workflow Builder. And if you're using Slack and you've got a paid instance of Slack, on the upper left-hand corner, click on the menu that is your workspace name. There will be a drop-down to Tools, a Workflow Builder, and that's where you can find it. If this is the first time you've ever seen this, you're like, what is she even talking about? So Workflow Builder was an important acquisition for us for all the reasons you might imagine. People who customize their Slack workspace with apps and workflow get more out of Slack, and they're happier with Slack, the product, as a result. And with Workflow Builder, more people can write workflows than can write Slack apps. So as it helps people get familiar with what apps and workflows can do for them in their daily workday, we know that we have to help people bridge that gap. They're like, okay, great that you've got this workflow tool. What am I even supposed to do with it? So we put in the work to create templates that people can download, remix, customize, like ones to help with remote work. So for example, reminders to drink water and walk around, or collecting information to share between teammates who might be time zone offset from one another, giving people the idea of what they should build in order to help launch them. And Workflow Builder is also immediately relevant to nearly all of our developers for one key reason. What would you guess is the most common type of integration developers create for Slack? The answer is on the slide. I gave that one to you. Setting up a webhook to fire into Slack is easy, and it's common, and it accounts for a lot of our integrations, in part because it is so easy to do. And we made it easy to make webhook notifications look great and be more useful. For those of you who are seeing this for the first time, this is our GUI tool called the BlockKit Builder, which is our way of building UI inside Slack. And you have the option of clicking on the left-hand side to add components to the view you see in the middle. And on the right-hand side, we show you the JSON payload that you'd have to ping into Slack in order to get the UI you see in the middle. And it's a very useful tool to build out the UI that you might want to attach to your webhook payload. So click on the left, live edit the JSON on the right, and on the upper right-hand corner, you can see the Send to Slack button that gives you a moment to preview it live and try it out before you set up your webhook. So it's super straightforward to create a webhook with some amount of nice UI in Slack. You go to our API dashboard on api.slack.com, you get your webhook endpoint, you hop over to the BlockKit Builder, a couple clicks, copy, paste, and you're off to the races. And that's great. But if you want to do something more complex after that, like let's say in that UI that you show attached to the webhook payload, you want to have somebody click a button and send a response to a person. The delta between being able to show some amount of UI and then having any interactivity is that at that point you have to jump and create an app. And that feels too complicated. So one of the first things that we did was make it easy to build a workflow off of a webhook, because this obviates the need for lots of small apps that developers build that are just giving a so what to their notification. So like, here's a notification, you want to do something with it. Does this merit building a little web app, having to figure out with corporate IT where you're going to host it, and so on and so forth? Or should we really double down on just making it super easy to have webhook into so what straight from the client? And the other nice thing that we enabled there is set up from within the Slack client. So you don't have to bounce out to our developer site, and it just takes a few clicks without leaving Slack to set this up. And this mattered a lot to us because we care a lot about the average use case. We talk a lot about our favorite shiny integrations that do incredibly powerful things. Like the LA Times deeply integrated their CMS with Slack so that editorial can emoji react to a story and immediately get it published to LAtimes.com. That is so cool. We are so happy that they did that. We also want to make sure that the people who are just here to do something quick and dirty can do that without it being a huge hassle, without it having to be a conversation with IT and so on. So the most important piece about this, though, is that we want to think about how we can expand this in a way that gives people even more power in what happens next, so that we can think of our platform in the future as individual pieces of functionality that you can cobble together Lego style to create the workflows that you want inside Slack. So in the last 6 months, we introduced a feature, Workflow Steps from Apps, that's designed to start bringing that feature now. It enables any Slack developer to create hooks into their app from Workflow Builder so that people writing workflows inside Slack would be able to tap into their services. And we've already seen companies who are using Workflow Builder make huge cost savings by putting triage flows into Workflow Builder with results written to a Google Sheet, for example. So we're seeing citizen development in Slack becoming more and more powerful as developers create those hooks. And it's not necessarily just hooks for apps in the app directory. You might want, for example, your BizTech team, just like Slack's, to create those individual pieces of functionality that they say are safe for people to cobble together into workflows and then enable them to go from there. So when we're thinking about the ways that we need to better enable developers to enable builders as a platform, we had to think about the developer experience of writing these low-code hooks. And I originally called this slide Tools on Tools for Tools, but I thought that that would probably only be funny to me and be really confusing for everybody else. So I called it very literally SDK support for writing your own steps. We have a developer framework Bolt that is an opinionated framework for how to build good Slack apps. And in supporting the Steps from Apps product, we built it in a way that makes it a lot more straightforward to follow the various steps for creating a workflow step, because you add a layer of complexity when somebody is going to be able to set up a connection to their app, and also they need to be able to configure it. So what Bolt does and what our documentation does for all of the workflow step creation is designed to make it more seamless for app developers who want to enable their colleagues or their customers to write integrations more easily. And it was important to write this into our main framework. It's not like we spun out a separate library that is all about steps from apps, because we really want to have app developers think of these steps and enabling the hooks for workflows and lower code flows as a key part of any type of app inside Slack. Because you don't want to enable just the end usage, but innovation. When you give these little modular pieces of functionality to people throughout your company and maybe even throughout your customer base, there's so much more that they can do with it. So as we iterate on workflow steps from apps, we will be making developer tooling along the way to make sure that it stays conceptually easy, but also stays top of mind for people. How can you enable others to do even more with your product through something like a hook into a low-code builder? So we're going to spend more and more time in the next few years investing in that area and that feature. Composable elements, like pieces of functionality that you can stack and compose just like Lego to get things done. And is it the right tool for every problem at every time? No, and I would never argue that. But as low-code platforms proliferate, 65% by 2024, that's wild. And they get closer to filling product gaps like debugging issues or like lack of features, you should consider how low code can fit into your own team's toolbox and the places that are common pain points that having something that maybe is signed off on by corporate IT can actually enable you to do things faster, easier, and with fewer headaches. And if not for yourselves, then think about the other people who you might be able to enable in doing it. Thank you very much. I have seen a handful of questions that I haven't really had time to read in the private chat, so I'm going to take a second and maybe start addressing some of those. Thank you again. Okay, question. How do I move past the fear of having my job taken by someone less trained than me? I know there has to be another way to look at this. And that's a great question. It's something that I think really has to depend organization to organization, but what this enables you to do is basically, if other people can take care of some of the more rote automation or small problem solving, it enables you with more training to look at some of the higher level problems like system wide. So think about the Slack on Slack program. If what you're getting from folks is an inbound of ideas. Sometimes the execution might be done by them. Sometimes it might be done by a developer like you. Or it might be that as you see more and more of these requests come in, you see systems that need to be built, like a generalized framework for all of the requests that are coming in from sales, or all of the requests that are touching a particular API, maybe from Workday. I think what we'll see is not necessarily that people will be displaced, but that you'll just move on to different problems and we'll all become more productive in that way. Hopefully that's a useful answer, but I think that is what the smart companies will see. And if other companies are being short-sighted, talent will go to the places where people are thinking about it right. I have heard Uncle Bob say that frameworks are not made for developers, they're made for the people selling platforms. How is this different? That's a great question. And I think that in the cases of looking at what platform is right for you, if you're part of that buying process, you should absolutely be poking around at what feature set they offer, how frequently they respond to customer requests, how much they're iterating on the product in terms of things like their debugging features. Not all low-code platforms are created equal. Some of them are designed for very specific end use cases. And if, for example, you feel like the differentiating factors that are driving the purchasing decision inside your company are at odds with usability from a developer point of view, that's probably a good entry point to make the argument, because so much of the marketing for these types of tool is about engineering hours saved. And if you think realistically, this is not going to save me a bunch of engineering hours because it is unusable for reason X, Y, and Z, that is, I think, a very good counter argument. But I would say take the time to evaluate the platform, because they're not all created equal. What's a common mistake that many low-code platforms make, in your opinion? Ooh, I haven't done enough of a survey to know that what a lot of low-code platforms do wrong. I think working alongside the team on workflow steps from apps made me appreciate the complexity of having a meta platform where you're enabling integrations with yet another layer of intermediation between an API that a company might already have and a way to hook into that as a platform. The ways that companies get around that complexity, and whether they either push it off on the developer to make the initial integration much easier for the end builder, or whether they just make their platform a little harder to learn, I think is one of the issues that you might see as you're comparing tools. All right, and last question that I had here is, what's the difference between low code and no code? They seem awfully similar. And yeah, basically the main difference is whether or not a platform lets you run some type of function or some amount of custom code, or requires that you write some amount of logic to connect all the pieces. There are definitely no code platforms where it really is just click, 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 and you're set up. And that was what I would call truly no code. Many platforms eventually do expand to allow you to do more flexible things by writing some script or some function, and that's when they move into the low-code territory. So that's where I would draw the distinction, but again, not a sole authority here, having only worked with a few of those low-code platforms.